You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Jennifer Robson back on the show with me today. She was with us last year talking about her phenomenal book, The Gown, and today we're talking about a brand new book that she has out called Our Darkest Night. And, you know, as we're collecting new books for the new year and you know, all of our fingers are crossed that 2021 is going to be a much better experience than 2020 was. And we're so happy to have 2020 in the rearview mirror. What a better book to start your year off with than Our Darkest Night. Jennifer Robson tackles historical fiction like no other person does. And this book is a true joy to have on your shelf. And I highly recommend everyone grab it. Jennifer, thank you for joining me again today.
Thank you. And what a lovely introduction. I'm sitting here just feeling a glow. That's very kind of you.
Well, thank you. So Jennifer, what's been going on this last year for you?
Well, my husband and I joke that we've had a lot of precious family togetherness. So, you know, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, we've actually been completely fine. I can't complain. Set against what so many people have been going through and continue to go through. You know, we both have work. We're both well. Our children are well. Our children are in school for the most part, which is a real blessing. You know, I have lots of friends whose kids are doing at-home schooling, and that is a challenge, not just for parents, but for students, for the teachers. Oh my goodness, they all deserve medals right now. So the first part of the year I was finishing work on Our Darkest Night. And I have to say, it was pretty interesting working on a book set in World War II with the backdrop of the world once again thrown into crisis, a really different crisis, but there were so many parallels,
Right.
just in terms of that whole chin up, we'll get through this together. You know, all the World War II songs kept coming back to me, and they seem to have a real resonance in terms of, you know, just the only way through is through, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Speaking of school and kids, my oldest son is a seventh grade English teacher. And he, you know, this getting to hear him kind of download on all of the struggles and, you know, what it means to actually try to teach kids. And, you know, are we in school this week? Are we not? Are we doing virtual? Are some kids doing virtual, some not?
Yeah.
Wow, it's been a challenge. And
it's been so hard for so many people. And I really, you know, again, I cannot complain. I really don't want to sound as if I'm complaining about anything because, you know, we have access to Wi-Fi at home. We have access to devices. But, you know, for a lot of families, that's a real challenge. And my heart is stretched in so many directions these days. And I guess, with the work I do, the only way I can hope to make things better for others, in the only grand plan I have is to write a book, to give you a book in which people have gone through similarly really hard times, but they've survived, and that there's hope, right? There's always that hope. It may seem like a little point of light in the far distance, but it's there.
What's going to be interesting, Jennifer, is seeing how a generation or two past us looks back on this time. You know, that World War II historical fiction or things around World War II have been having a great resurgence. Maybe is the proper word. The last couple of years, my point is there's been a lot of great books about this time period that have come out the last couple of years, and I often sit and think about what is it about this time period that makes us so fascinated, where we long for more of the human stories of this time. And I have a theory that the farther we get away from an historical event, the more it gets reduced to bullet points. Because
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
If you take history class for an example, you can only, when you have a time period to cover, each of those events get distilled down to kind of the big happenings. And what happens there, I theorize, is that we lose all of the human stories, all of the stories of the characters that we could connect with. Maybe they're family members, maybe they're someone who went through things similar to what our family members went through, but we can connect with this time through stories and through characters of this time. And it's going to be interesting to see, because World War II has, now we're 2 decades away from 100 years ago. And, I had grandparents and great uncles and things that served in the war, and they're all gone on now. But, these were people that I sat and talked to as a kid, and they're all gone now.
Yeah.
So we hold on to these stories, but it's going to be interesting 100 years from now to see what people look back on this time period and how they interpret it. It's going to be really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder whether I'll have a great grandchild who will decide to make their living writing historical fiction, maybe set in this time period. I mean, that's the great thing about historical fiction, and specifically the kind of historical fiction that I like to read and that I write. In that it's focused not on these big moments. It's important to know the big moments. You can't really be an historian. You can't teach it unless all the big plot points, as it were. But you also cannot lose sight of the individual story of the humanity at the heart of people's, the people who lived through that period and their stories. And it's really easy to do with something as big as the Second World War. The numbers are so numbing. When you get into the millions, it's very hard to remember that behind each individual person caught up in the war, there's a whole lifetime of stories. And particularly when people were killed before they, war is unnatural in that people die who would otherwise have lived much fuller, longer lives. And that's something the great First World War poet Wilfred Owen talked about. There's this one line in one of his poems where he said, called "Strange Meeting," where he says, "Foreheads of men have bled where no wounds were." And what he's trying to get at is that if it had not been for the war, that these men that he's talking about, specifically these soldiers, would have gone on and lived lives, and who knows what they would have done. And so then you look at the Second World War, and I mean, when you're talking about tens of millions of people, it's really hard to wrap your head around it, that volume of loss and suffering. And I think it's numbing in terms just intellectually, but it can also kind of numb your heart, really. And so what I'm trying to get at in this book and the other books I've written is the stories, the individual people who went. What was it like? What did it feel like to be caught up in this terrible time? And a terrible time that like any time in history has wonderful moments caught up in it as well, which of course makes it a little more complicated to write about. But I think that's the reason this war just has such a hold over us. And it will do for decades, even as direct memories are lost, and that we won't be able to talk to anyone who lived through it before too long. And that's, where people like me come in, historians, novelists, artists who want to kind of preserve the memories, but also explore those memories and ask what they tell us about ourselves as humans. And I'm not sure, I may move away from the wartime period here and there, but I feel as if it's a period I'm going to come back to again.
So from our last conversation last year when we talked, I think I remember that your father was a history professor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I assume that you get your part of your love of history from there. But if I remember right, we had this conversation about that people assume that he's where you get your love of historical fiction. That's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, which I'm so glad you remember that. It was actually my mom who is the great fiction reader. And she had, all the stuff through the 1970s and 80s, these big, the 1980s were a great period for really massive works of historical fiction. The door stoppers, right? I mean, and I can't imagine myself writing a book that's that long. My personal, I just love a book that hits between the 350 and the 400 page mark. Sitting there, just a hair over 100,000 words. That's the sweet spot for me. But I certainly grew up on those novels, and I think they kind of they gave me a love of not just the history. And the history, of course, it was just everywhere in my house. It was something we talked about all the time. I had my grandmother and my grandfather were caught up in World War II as journalists. So it was something that loomed large. And my mom died when I was only 21, so she hasn't been around to see this work that I've done. But I like to think when I write a book that it's the kind of thing that if she were around, I could put in her hands and say, "I think you'll like this book, Mom." Because what she loved about historical fiction were, again, stories, the personal stories, the social history that's wrapped up in it. I mean, I trained as a social historian. That's what my degree is. My DPhil, as they call it at Oxford, or my PhD is in social history. It's not in the big sweeping questions of the time. It's kind of a deeper examination of the doctoral thesis itself is indescribably boring. But what I was really interested in were the daily lives, ordinary lives of just regular people, and the shape of those lives. And I went about it by looking at how just the issue of clothing, not fashion, just clothes, affected the lives of from around the time of the end of the First World War to the end of the Second World War. And what it gave me was an appreciation for, even in times that that weren't during the war, say in that interwar period, that there's so much work involved in people's daily lives apart from their actual work. Just the labor involved in everything is something I think we don't really appreciate. I think probably the people who would appreciate it most in this day and age would be farmers, for example, in terms of just the huge amount of work that begins the minute you open your eyes in the morning and doesn't end when you fall asleep. And that's something that, again, in the past year, in the pandemic months of sitting at home and occasionally feeling a little hard done by, that some of the things that I've been used to, I didn't have access to. Whenever I found myself starting to feel a little grumpy, I would try and remember what it was like for my grandparents, my great grandparents, and if we're talking about this book that has just come out, my husband's family, who were farmers in northern Italy, and if they wanted to eat, they had to work in a way that is completely foreign to many of us today, and certainly is foreign to my own children, who,
Yeah.
who I'm constantly reminding, what their nonna no and their great grandparents, what it costs those people in terms of work and sacrifices, so that my children could live this life of luxury. Um, and nobody's suggesting that my children go out and work in the fields. I've had moments, I must say. I've had moments, but nobody's saying they have to. That I want to honor the people that came, and I think in some ways, one of the things that motivated me when I wrote Our Darkest Night was to honor that generation that lived through the war and its aftermath, and the sacrifices many of them made, and just the work.
Yeah.
The work involved. It's humbling when I look at the shape of my ordinary day, set it against the day of, say, my husband's grandmother. I really have nothing to compare about, to complain about, I must say.
I feel like that when you take on a project like this, that you would almost need to feel a personal connection with the story that you're telling, because there's all sorts of fiction that gets told as the writer is just sitting there daydreaming and just thinking things up, and the story unfolds from there. But when you're dealing with a time period and a people and the circumstances that a book like Our Darkest Night tackles, that you would need to feel some sort of personal connection there to get your husband's story. Is that the personal connection for you?
So the personal connection is one of these things that, and I think this happens to a lot of people, especially now as the kind of the wartime generation is becoming quite elderly. And, those of us with questions are maybe asking them maybe a little more forcefully than we might have done when, say, we were, teenagers or kids. So we were visiting Italy. This will be coming up 5 years ago. It was my husband's 50th birthday, and just the two of us had gone to Italy, shockingly, leaving the children behind. Everyone there was horrified that we had not brought the children with us, but we just wanted a week of being in Italy. And so we visited my husband's family there, and his late father was one of 12, and his late mother is one of 5. So there is an abundance still of aunts and uncles and cousins and second cousins, and just you name it. I mean, there are many, many relatives to visit. And a few days into our visit there, and I should add that he comes from, his parents came from a beautiful little town called Sanzanone delle Azzolini, which is in the Veneto. It's about, by car, about 45 minutes from the mainland near Venice, up to in the direction of the northwest towards if you imagine you're heading towards Austria and the Alps. And so it's in the foothills of the mountains, beautiful, beautiful countryside. And they don't get a ton of tourists there. It's a pretty quiet town. And so we were visiting his Zia Maria, his Aunt Maria, who is in her late 80s now and had been a little girl during the war. And they were speaking in the local dialect, which is a Venetian dialect, which, it is not Italian. I mean, it bears a lot of resemblance to Italian, but it's in its own way a different language. And I can understand it reasonably well. When people are talking about ordinary things like the weather and the food and people's health and so on. And my husband was asking Zia Maria, just he was interested in asking her about the war. What was it like on the farm, and we'd heard some stories, but we'd never really talk that much with his parents about the war, even though they knew what I did for a living. They read my earlier books. And so it wasn't that she was reluctant. It's just that she's not used to talking about it. There's that reticence that is, this is not an uncommon thing for people to be reticent when talking about the war, because it's also a time of trauma for many people. Why would you want to go digging up terrible memory? But she was willing enough. And at some point in the conversation, which I was mostly following, I knew that Claudio would bring me up to speed later. I heard she used the word ebre, which immediately got my attention because it's the word for Jewish or a Jewish person. And I remember I kind of clutched at my husband's sleeve and was, what is this? And he was, he kind of did, she's talking. and one of the other sentences that kind of untangled itself, and here my accent is terrible when I'm speaking the dialect, but she said, "Tu nono I gasconti," and what that translates as is, "Your nono, he hid them."
Oh, wow.
And so I feel as if I was ready to fall off the chair. I mean,
oh yeah,
it just was crazy to me. And I had been part of this family at that point for something close to 20 years. And I had never heard a thing about anything like hiding Jewish people, like, well, what hiding where? And so we dug in you're not about to put the thumb screws to, your elderly aunt. There's a limit to how much we could press her, right?
Right.
But within the confines of what she felt comfortable about talking about, we didn't want to tire her out and so on. But it came out, and then we talked to her younger sister who hadn't been alive during the war, but Giangia Rosa, was born right after the war, actually, and kind of grew up in that post-war period and knew all the family stories. And again, it wasn't so much that she'd ever kept the story from us. She just it had never occurred to her to tell us. And so it came out that the parish priest, the local parish priest, during the war, when things were starting to kind of really go sideways, so this would be 1943, the Nazi occupation had begun. And I mean, Italy had been under fascist rule for decades at that stage. Let's not whitewash things, but things got appreciably worse from 43 onwards. And the village priest came to her parents, so my husband's grandparents and his aunt's parents came to them, and their names were Giovanni and Emma, and came to them and asked if they would be willing to hide people who were in danger of, being arrested and deported and Lord knows what else. These were people that had come to him for help, and he felt that he had to help them, that it was the only right thing to do. And if they did agree, it would have to be in complete secrecy for everyone's sake. And so they agreed. And over the course of the years, we believe they took in as many as 3 different families who would stay for a period and then move on. And one family they became very close to, and they stayed for quite a long time. And then after the war, my late mother-in-law and one of her sisters even went to visit them. I mean, again, she never told me this.
Wow.
I just, if I could just have Ma back for one conversation, to just ask her these questions. I really wish I could ask. So we had these stories, but at that point they were just stories. I mean, there was no way I couldn't prove any of it. And it's not for one moment do I think that anybody was making this up or lying. That's not the case. It's more that memory can be very fallible.
Sure. And
it can be easy to kind of to just get a slightly incorrect impression of something, and then it builds up. So I would never accuse anyone of being untruthful, but sometimes memories can get a little bit twisted around. And I wanted to I needed to know more. The historian in me needed to know more. So I started by contacting Yad Vashem in Israel at the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, and it turned out that they were right about the priest, because their local priest, whose name was Father Odostoko, he was recognized by Yad Vashem in 2010 and was named righteous among the nations, which is quite a rare distinction. There's I'm not sure the number in total, but I think it's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people worldwide have been given that honor, which, when you think of relative to the number of people who are living in Europe during the war, it's a pretty small number. So he was recognized as having saved more than 50 Jews during the war by hiding them among his parishioners and supporting them and just really, preventing their arrests and deportations, because we know what happened to those who were deported. They were sent to Birkenau, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and they were murdered. Almost everyone who was deported was murdered. Vanishingly few survived. So one thing is that and Yad Vashem recognized this, that a handful of the local parishioners were also honored because the people they rescued were still alive, helped to save. I mean, I think the people they helped did their own rescuing, frankly, but they were there to bear testimony. But they also recognized that that was only a portion of people in Sanzanone, because effectively the whole village was in on it. There were people hiding in many, many houses in the village because of Father Stocco. And so it's my belief that my husband's grandparents were among them. And I'll say candidly, I can't prove it. They're not alive. We don't really have any names. No one can remember the names of the people we think they might have helped. So that's gone, right? I can't recreate that.
Right.
And so the question for me next was, well, what do I do with this knowledge? And I didn't want to turn it into a work of nonfiction. I didn't want to fictionalize their story. That just felt wrong on every level.
Sure.
But what I could do was use that as an inspiration point in terms of asking myself, well, what was it like to be one of the people who had to go into hiding? What was it like to lose everything? Your not just your belongings in your home and your profession, but also your nationality. To be told that even though you had been born in Italy, you'd grown up in Italy, your language was Italian, your cultural identity was Italian, that suddenly you were not Italian, that you were not wanted, that you were an alien, as people, as Italian Jews were officially described. They were alien, and thus subject to all the indignities that go along with that. What was that like? And so the character of Antonina revealed herself to me quickly. I could just see her. Yeah, I could hear her voice. I could listen in on her thought. And she's the character that took me from Venice into the unknown of when she's sent into hiding by her father, and she's sent to stay with this complete stranger. She is some assurances from her father and her father's friend, who's the parish priest in the little village they're going to, that the man she's being sent to live with is a decent man, a good man. But does she really know? And on top of everything else, she has to pretend that she's married to him, so that people will believe the story they've concocted. And so I send her off into this world of unknown and has to figure out a way to survive. And that's my attempt to kind of bring to life just one possible story among the thousands of true stories that happened to the Italy's Jews in this period. And it's a story that hasn't been told that much, interestingly.
It
When you
hasn't.
set it against the dozens and dozens, hundreds of books, um, set in that have been written in recent years that are set in Poland and Germany and France, talking about what happened during the Holocaust. And I just had this question of, I hadn't again seen much that directly addressed what happened to Italy's Jews during the war, and I wanted to know. So that's where, and it just started in terms of my attaching it to an idea of a book. It started with my son asking me if the stories were true, and I had to tell him I wasn't sure, and so that led me on my detective, hunt, and it ended up with Our Darkest Night.
I love it, and I'm hoping that through books like Our Darkest Night that we get to fill in some shading of what we understand of history, because we all know the stories of what happened in Germany, but there was so much more suffering and so much more human conflict all over the world at that time, and the stories are relentless. I think we will be uncovering and fleshing out these for years and years and years to come. And so, as someone who is trained as an historian, but also writes historical fiction, how do you how do I ask this? How do you feel that the two different works, one's a pure history and historical fiction, and if historical fiction is done correctly, then we know that the personal stories are made up, but it still conveys truths of what happened. So where do these two different forms, how should we hold them as readers?
So that's it. That is a fantastic question. I think so. The thing with narrative nonfiction history, or any form of history, that's, even then, even the most accomplished historian, the most diligent historian, must admit that it is at some point a work of reconstruction. Because let's think, like, things that even happened last week, we can all be a little hazy on.
Sure.
So go back decades, centuries, millennia, and then to say that it is the absolute, quite literal truth is a stretch, is a claim that no historian should ever make. So to that extent, when I'm creating fiction, it's not so very different, in the sense that, yes, I'm researching things diligently. I am doing my very best to provide an accurate portrait of the past. But I have to be honest and say that there are always going to be inaccuracies in the book. There is absolutely no way to know with certainty that what I'm talking about is the truth. And that, because that in itself is, how do we judge that? Who stands there and like the, the skating judges on the side in the Olympics, right, and says, this is a 10 out of 10. I mean, the only thing that would resolve these questions is a time machine. And until physicists work that out for us, the best we can do, I think the best you can do is just to be diligent and to do your absolute very best, to not cut corners, and to accept that the end result will be by necessity imperfect to some degree. There just will be imperfections. Now, where I differ at writing fiction is that, so I take the backdrop, and I'd like to think that I create something that is as accurate as any piece of narrative nonfiction. And then on top of that backdrop, I layer in my characters and the world, say the characters and the events that move along the plot of the book. And the events, everything has to kind of fit onto the, really, I guess I've called it this before, the scaffolding that I've created.
Yeah.
Everything has to hang off it, just so. And to that degree, I don't manipulate events. If I avoid that. Occasionally, I will. I may add in minor details that seem to be part of this historical record. I know they're not, and I try and address that in my author's notes. When I've actually made something up wholesale and made it seem as if it, quite often by virtue of there being a real figure at the periphery, and it can sometimes seem to readers as if I'm talking about something that happened. And I want to be very careful to differentiate, those moments in my books where fiction brushes up that seems like real event. But I can admit, Antonina never existed. Nico didn't exist. His family didn't exist. The terrible Nazi that becomes part of the proceedings did not exist. But they're all inspired, not so much by actual people. There's no individual who inspired Antonina. Really, the only character in the book who has a direct parallel in real life is Father Bernardi, who was, he's not a portrait of the real Father Stocco, but he's more or less his equivalent in the book.
Sure.
But they're works of fiction, but they're grounded in truth, if
Right.
that makes any sense.
Sure.
Because the things that happen to them not only have to be possible within the understanding of what we know from the historical record, but they also have to be plausible. They have to make sense in just a broader, in a broader way. If something happens to Antonina in the book, it just has to be something that I can see possibly happening to another person. And so, and one thing I was very keen on that I was determined not to do when I was writing this book was to take the experience of any real person who had been caught up in the Holocaust and subsume it into my story. That just the possibility of that I found very troubling. So, for example, and I don't want to give too much away about the book because I think it just came out. I'm not sure a lot of people would have had a chance to read it, but there are certain moments where Antonina is caught up and kind of thrown into moments that are part of the historical record
Sure.
in terms of certain events that happened in the latter years of the war. And it would have been easy to just almost kind of remove a person from the historical record and pop Nina into that person's place. And I just felt so wrong about doing that. So wherever Nina appears to be part of historical events, because I've added her rather
Right.
than taken away from someone else.
Sure.
That was really, really important to me.
That's an important distinction.
It is. And it's one of these fine things that I'm not sure, 99 out of 100 people reading the book would not ever notice it. I wouldn't want them necessarily to notice it.
But
or
you
to
notice.
I notice it. Yeah. And I just think because the chance of somebody who has a personal connection with the Holocaust and of say they're reading it and noticing it and being upset because I've got things wrong. That was too horrifying to me for me to ever risk kind of playing fast and loose with the facts as we know them. And when I say as we know them, I mean the facts are indisputable.
Sure.
But we don't know all of the facts, is what I mean to say, and that there's so many layers of human experience that of which we're ignorant, and no one, not even the most learned historian, can profess to know the true depth, the true kind of wellspring of misery that came out of the Holocaust.
Right.
But I'm struggling a little bit to find my words because it's something that is so profound. I think it actually defies description. But the thing is for as much as we will never, I don't think historians, artists, writers, we will never plumb the depths of this moment in human history. I just don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of it. But that's not a reason for us to stop trying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Our Darkest Night is available everywhere now and is a glimpse into a period of time and events that I was sorely ignorant of. And I know so many other people were. And this book has helped to open my eyes to the realities. Jennifer, I know this book has been off your desk for probably a couple of months now. We know how the publishing process goes, but what have you turned your attention to now? What can we expect from you coming up next?
I've returned to Britain, which I'm such an Anglophile that it drew me back again. And it may seem on the surface that it's another Royals book that I'm writing, although it's really not. My working title is Coronation Year. It's set in 1953, which is the year that the young Queen Elizabeth was crowned. I mean, she became queen in 1952, but it takes a long time to plan these big events. And the setting for the book is just a very small, modest, almost one of these places you would pass by without noticing. It's a hotel that's been around forever in London called Oliver's. It's completely fictional, I should add. And Oliver's Hotel and the people who work there are caught up in the coronation because, much to their surprise, when the coronation, when the parade route, the processional route is announced, it goes down their little street, which is not normally what happens. And so I'm actually looking at it now in my study, this huge map of the procession route for the coronation. And I can see the spot where I've squeezed Oliver's Hotel between two existing buildings. And so there's the day-to-day story of that year and people's lives, just as Britain really becomes to kind of, it emerges almost from the chrysalis, really, of that kind of post-war austerity and frankly misery. And so we see, the characters in the book really kind of, figuring out how to live again. But they're also then caught up in there's a vaguely suspense-ish moment in the book, because there are some threats against the coronation and the safety of the Queen, and it seems increasingly that they're coming from the hotel itself. So my characters have to figure out who's the person who's plotting against the coronation, and will there be some kind of an attack? Who knows? And all those thorny plot points are the things I'm working on now. But I hope to have figured it all out before too long. And that should come out sometime in next year, if maybe early 2023, but more likely 2022, which honestly seems like so far away, but it apparently it's not.
Apparently it is not. Well, I cannot
my
wait.
goodness, yeah.
I cannot wait to read that book. Jennifer, and I can just extend the invitation now that when that book comes out, please come back and talk about it with me.
Oh, I would love to. I would love to.
Well, Our Darkest Night is on sale everywhere now. It came out a day or two ago. You can get it, in real paper if you,
Yes.
like to go to your bookstore and pick up books, or Kindle edition or audiobook. I can't wait to listen to the audiobook of this. I bet it's going to be fascinating.
It's the same narrator as Marisa Callan, who did the gown, and she's done a lovely, lovely job in it. I should add that if people want signed copies, there are a number of independent bookstores over the United States and Canada, all over the place, who have limited numbers of signed book plates. And they're these beautiful stickers that have been designed to go with a book that I've signed, and they're free of charge. If you go into the bookstore and buy your copy from them, they will give you one of the book plates. And so the list of all the participating bookstores is on my website at jennifer-robson.com.
That is fantastic news. We're going to send everyone to your website to go check out where they can get their own autographed book plate and to go with their book. Jennifer, we also are going to put links in the show notes where to make it easy for people to find all of that good stuff, and we'll send them over to see you. Thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Both Barrels Publishing is the brainchild of successful indie author James P. Sumner. He has self-published over 15 titles in the last 5 years and has over 800,000 downloads so far in his career, meaning he has a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with the indie publishing community. Knowing the struggles of the modern-day indie author as well as he does, he wanted to create a platform that would allow writers of any level to learn the ropes, navigate the pitfalls, and produce a professional novel without wasting time or money in the process. Both Barrels Publishing is the perfect one-stop shop for any indie author, combining James's expertise with his own team of editors and designers so you can help your novel realize its full potential and learn how to publish yourself. The purpose of Both Barrels Publishing is to help indie authors get their novels ready for publication without all the stress, hassle, and unnecessary expense. We want to make your lives easier, which is why we're giving you access to a top-notch team to publish your novels, along with a generous discount on their services. You can also work one-on-one with James to learn the intricacies of self-publishing. No hidden cost, no false promises. We simply want you to publish the best version of your novel. BothBarrelsPublishing.com.